actually the hardest part of the writing process isn't the actual writing. It's figuring out what to write.
Mm-hmm.
That is really hard.
And it gets easier the longer you live with it. It's, it becomes part of you.
Methods. So again, this is a very brief proposal. A lot of times you kind of have to gauge how much of your method you want to share given the amount of space that you have. And so if this is the amount of space you have and it's little, you need a name for your method. It's much easier for people to figure out what it is you're doing if you give your method a name, because the people that are reading the proposals typically are themselves researchers and will know what that name is. So if you're doing an experiment, don't say I'm doing a study. In this part, you say I'm doing an experiment. If you're doing a survey, I'm doing a survey. I'm doing cross-sectional. Use the terminology from the research, mixed methods, that gives a name to the method. And then all of the different specifics that you provide will have a basis for linking in the person who's reading it's mind to what is included in that method. If you say I'm doing an experiment, and then you're doing something really that nobody else but you understands as an experiment, you need to explain why your procedures actually are an experiment. If you're doing a standard garden variety experiment, just like anybody, I'm modifying this, it's the independent variable, I'm looking at this outcome, it's the dependent variable. If it's a garden variety experiment, you don't have to go into great detail. You can say I'm doing an experiment, I'm testing the efficacy of this treatment, well, there'll be a treatment and control group, and people will get the gist of it, right, even in a short space. But if you're, I just sat on a proposal defense on a committee I'm on yesterday, where the experimental treatment is watching a video and responding. Well, that's an unusual sort of experimental treatment. And so the dissertation student had a greater obligation to explain why on earth this thing was an experiment and how it constituted an experiment than if she'd just been looking at efficacy, which is often evaluated experimentally.
One of the things that I find in social science proposals is that sometimes we don't necessarily state the inclusion-exclusion criteria of who we're including in the study. So you might say you're doing surveys and interviews, and I'm like, of whom? Why? So, if it's children, if it's parents, if it's male, female, if it is quantitative, I probably want to hear a little bit about the power of the study, for, the sample size. But I think that those are pretty important. If you're studying two populations, why are those populations important? Are you going to compare and contrast them? So yes, the methodology is absolutely about the methods that you are going to employ, but it's very much about what you're studying as well. To what or to whom are you applying those methods?
And I would even say that the population should come out in your rationale. You should identify your target population, because you're going to be identifying the need. If it is, issues related to reading or access to certain resources, who is this a problem to, and what are the consequences, of not addressing that problem with this population. So within the methods section, you might identify the population more specifically. I will be collecting data from this particular school district or set of schools, and this age group of students or people or individuals, and so it's more specific. And so if the rationale is why is this important, the methods I often view is how are you going to do this? And so a lot of times we use established instruments, measurement tools. So one of the things I look for is some explanation of the measurement tool, its reliability, so that I know that it's a reliable instrument that's been used. And I think one of the things that we've seen on the research committee is people don't cite the references. And so if you have an instrument, make sure you're including where that instrument's from so we know, hey, this is a legitimate instrument, and that you're reporting the reliability statistics. And so I know that your research questions that you've presented match up with what the instrument is intended to do. So that information should also be included in the methods section.
allow the students to address access. So, for example, I don't see an appendix, so if they, are going to do a study in a school district, how do they demonstrate that they actually have access to that population?
We do they have an opportunity to attach appendices of like a letter of support
Okay.
from their advisor and from a school district, whatever they might need to kind of.
Didn't we have to put in the IRBs?
You do put in the
Right,
IRB,
so that would never have been approved without a letter of permission.
Yeah, and usually
as
that
well.
does. And
That's
sometimes
part of
students
it.
will put,
Okay,
yeah,
good.
definitely put that in. We've seen, just recently saw a couple different letters of support from that.
Mhm.
Yeah. As a reviewer, to me, access is critical. I mean, I always give this example.
That's a big part.
It was a faculty grant. We once had a faculty member who said he was going to be the first American doing research in the secret police archives of the Polish National Library. Great proposal. We didn't give him the funding because we didn't believe he was actually going to be the first American there. It turned out the letter was in the drawer and he just forgot to give it in the proposal. And we got it afterwards and he was funded. But for a lot of proposals, even interviews, if you say that you're going to interview some real bigwig that is, absolutely critical to your study, you need to prove that you have access to that person. Or if you're collaborating with somebody and really reliant upon their skills, you need to have something in there that says, yes, I know who this person is, and yes, I'm going to work with them.
And do it early, because I thought, I'm working I'm researching in the school in which I work, and I had talked to my boss, everybody was on board with it, but I think the school district got a little intimidated by the IRB form. It's so formal, and there was a lot of hoops that took me a lot longer than I thought. Went all the way up to the superintendent, and they wanted to make sure that students were going to be safe, and it all worked out, but there was a point where I was like, what if, I've gotten so far and they pull the reins, so don't wait.
Don't underestimate that.
Mm-hmm. Don't assume you're going to have access.
And I think because we require the IRB approval,
Mm-hmm.
and the IRB approval process requires you to demonstrate you have access, that it's implied.
Right.
But if you're thinking about a different grant proposal that isn't asking for your IRB, then that's an issue that you absolutely need to address and make it clear. And many grants will ask you to have, if you say you're going to work in Alexandra Local School District, or you're going to work at Trimble School District, that you have a letter from the school district among your letters of support to say, yes, we're going to let these people work in our district. Because it's not a given that you just pick a school district and you automatically get there.
I think another critical part of methods are the timelines. We've sort of touched on that before. But I think that you need to tell the reviewers where you are in the project. If you're really at the beginning, data collection phase, that's a lot different than saying that you're now, heading towards your analysis and your dissemination phase. And we need to know that.
I think making a timeline is just beneficial to the researcher because now I print mine out and I'm using it as a checklist. Like, okay, I said by October 15th this was going to be done, and nobody's checking in on me like, did you get this done? But it keeps you on track. I think I've seen a lot of my friends collect data and then just, they've got a mountain in front of them and it's really intimidating to jump back in there and start analyzing. So if you could build in analyzing along the way and put that in your timeline and keep it as a schedule for yourself, it's going to be helpful.
It's one of the many pieces to our rationale or our application process that is often missing from students' applications.
You guys asked for mine, and I was like, oh, I didn't know you had it. I mean, I had it already. It was simple to just slap it in there, but.
And so it's in the guidelines, and that's why that first slide that was like, read the guidelines and read the guidelines again, is very important and kind of take it for granted. But
maybe I took it a little too general,
Yeah,
It's like, this is what I'm doing about this time, but.
And hopefully our new application process will kind of prevent some of those things from occurring. But if you're thinking about applying for that funding, make sure the timeline's in there and the dissemination plan is in there. And that's easy stuff to do, and kind of like
it's a table, I mean, my
Yeah.
timeline is
So,
just action plan.
but it's
table.
important, like you had pointed out, it can be beneficial to the researcher, and it certainly is beneficial to the reviewers, because they like to get an idea of, you know, okay, what is the plan of attack here? Where do you intend to be at different points?
I also like to see, out of your different activities, I like to see where the overlap is. You know, what are the go, no-go decisions? Oh, this activity can't be done until this
Mhm.
other activity is being done. So they're being done in series, whereas some other activities are being done in parallel. You know, and for this one that's already been approved by your dissertation committee, it's less critical, but one of the things that we tend to find in research sometimes is that the students don't understand how their different activities may be contingent upon one another, and that they could have a failure in one that will actually impact the rest of the study. And so that's one of the things that we're always telling them, you know, just be aware of how your activities and your research questions really are interrelated. And that table can show that.
Mhm.